Hi, my name is Michelle. This is my review of Mapping the Margins by Crenshaw. Um, I found it really interesting because of my previous work with domestic violence victims. Um, One of the primary interests of my studies are domestic violence victims and other trauma survivors. So it was an important piece for me to read, I feel. Um, so, of course, this section about battered women and the way their race intersects with their femaleness was that hit very close to home for me. Because I did, during the time that I worked in the domestic violence shelter, interact with women who were victims in many different ways. For example, there was the section where he talked about women who were unable to speak English and were therefore unable to find safe lodgings in the sheltered setting. And I do specifically remember one woman who'd been rescued from human trafficking. And that woman, because she was an undocumented immigrant, she was not only unable to communicate well, but she was also pregnant. And when her pregnancy was threatened, she refused to go to the hospital because she was afraid that um, she'd be deported immediately, or in this society or in um, this particular moment, she might have been put in a concentration camp on the border. Anything really could have happened to her. This was only, I believe, it was like 2 years ago or last year. So, I mean, it was not only was she the victim of human trafficking, she was also re-victimized over and over because she couldn't correctly request help. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that in the setting of the domestic violence shelter, we didn't have medical personnel. We could only accept people who were physically healthy, um, or they had to go to the hospital. So if something had happened to her, she could have died. She could have lost her child. Um, it was, at that point, the only thing that the management could do was make threats toward her, which were either go to the hospital or you can't stay here, because we couldn't be, with the funding of a nonprofit organization, we couldn't really be responsible for anything bad that happened to her, unfortunately. So I actually don't know. I think she left. She left right around the same time I did, so it's hard to say what actually happened to her. But there were so many cases where, there were women who we could not keep safe because of the limitations of the female versus racial or handicap status, or various other uh, intersectionalities. We couldn't keep them safe. We couldn't keep them alive. I don't know if some of those women are alive because of the limitations of their race. Now, and there were very few women who were white and middle class that I saw in that setting, because for the most part, women who were white and middle class had support. They had family support. It was always the women that were falling through the cracks, the women who were having to rely on underfunded nonprofits for their very survival. Those women were the ones that we saw. So, I mean, really, there was nobody there who wasn't directly influenced by the ability, or by the intersectionality of their place in society. Um, So it was a really important article for me to read because it hit home. And the section where he talked about um, where he talked about how shelters were not set up to handle these things, that really hit home as well, because I know there are women that were turned away for reasons like that. And it's appalling as a person who was a domestic violence advocate and wanted nothing more than to help the women and children or men, very rarely, that came into my sphere. It was really difficult to have to turn people away because we weren't um, capable of taking care of them. So there was one section that actually gave me chills in reading it. Um, Thus, the struggle over incorporating these differences is not a petty or superficial conflict about who gets to sit at the head of the table. In the context of violence, it is sometimes a deadly serious matter of who will survive and who will not. So this video is getting too long, so I'm going to draw it to a close. But I think it's still very important to actual people's human lives that we understand that these intersections do exist and that they do still cause problems and that they are a matter of survival. Thank you.